Thank you. Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody. And thank you very much to our moderator. I don't feel any pressure whatsoever. I thought I would tell you a story about one of the experiments that we carried out in the process of developing a just transition in South Africa. It's, I suppose, the only way one can spin it as a political leader is to say that the reason that you have a guinea pig is because it's the place where you learn and where you make mistakes. So what happened is that there was a pilot project for the decommissioning of one of our coal-fired power stations in South Africa. That coal-fired power station is called Komati. And many years ago, it was a very major power generator. Of course, like most of our coal-fired power stations, it's situated in a province called Mpumalanga, which is where we mine coal. And this power station was a village, grew up around the power station. Those who lived in that village and who still live in that village were workers at the power station and their families, and a whole range of people who worked in the broader value chain of the power station and who supplied goods and services to that power station. They delivered coal, they did maintenance, and the women in that community provided lunch and breakfast and social support and ran taverns and raised children and did all the other things that we women do to keep families together. Now, the decommissioning of this power station happened during the COVID pandemic. So it started in 2020 and it went through 21, 22. And that's quite an important issue because the fact that it was happening under various forms of social restriction and lockdowns impacted on the extent to which there was consultation with the community. So when this process began, everybody agreed that in order to have a just transition, those who work in the power station and those who are working in the broader value chain have to be involved in the consultation about what happens after the power station is decommissioned. They must be consulted beforehand. Everybody agreed that that workers in the power station must not lose their jobs and they must be given alternative livelihoods. And there was also agreement that there need to be new programs, new projects, and new livelihoods that the broader community would benefit from. But what actually happened was that the process, as I said, began during the COVID period. During the lockdown period, there were restrictions on public meetings. There were restrictions on consultation. And so instead of a situation which was originally envisaged, where there would be big public meetings and broad forms of public engagement, the consultation process started happening behind closed doors with small groups of people who were representatives of organized labor, of community formations, and so on. And the consequence of what happened in that process is that, with the benefit of hindsight, which, as you know, is the perfect science, we can see that there was limited report back from those public representatives to the affected stakeholders. And so, in the process of saying what is going to happen with repowering of this power station, what kinds of alternative livelihoods are going to be created, how are we going to ensure that this process of decommissioning benefits the broader community and creates socio-economic development? That process didn't happen. What happened was that those who were best organized, which were those workers who were working in Komati Power Station and who were members of management-recognized trade unions, those workers were transferred from that power station to other power stations, and where appropriate, they moved together with their families. But those who were less organized, those who were the service providers, those who were working in the broader value chain, doing maintenance and delivering coal and all kinds of other services, those workers or those micro-entrepreneurs were not properly consulted and were not properly involved in the co-creation of alternatives. The women in that community who were running informal trading stalls, providing the breakfast and the lunch and the beers and the childcare and everything else that women do on a daily basis. So, sometime after the decommissioning and after complaints were raised about what happened in that process, the Presidential Climate Commission went back there and held a range of public hearings to understand what had happened and what people felt about the decommissioning process now. So, and all of this is written up in a report. It's on the website of the Presidential Climate Commission of South Africa, and it makes very interesting reading and is an excellent learning case study for how not to do this process. So the first thing that the Presidential Climate Commission found, as I've already explained to you, provision, ecosystem of the power station were now unemployed. And they were extremely bitter about the process and that there weren't, in fact, alternative livelihoods for them. And the women no longer had customers for all of the informal services that they had been providing. And while there was some thinking about what happens to the service providers in the value chain, there hadn't really been any thinking about the informal services that women and breadwinners in that community had been providing. And so not only were the men no longer having a livelihood, the women who had been dependent on their custom also now no longer have a livelihood. But the final issue that I want to share with you, that for me was so significant about this situation, is that there has been in that community an exponential rise in gender-based violence. And we can speculate why. We can speculate that men who no longer have an income-generating purpose in families are experiencing frustration, and they're taking out that frustration on their families. Women who previously had a source of income and might have been in a position to extricate themselves from abusive relationships no longer have that source of income and cannot remove themselves easily from that situation. So I thought I should share this with you today because it really tells you a lot about what happens if, before you begin a process, you don't start with the end in mind. And I think that what we've learned from this process is that the end in mind has to be, first of all, not just the workers in the power station, because those workers but one has to consider those who are involved in the broader value chain. But secondly, one needs to have a very specific focus on the question of the women and the girls in the community and what role they are playing in the economic ecosystem and what alternatives would be available for them. This pilot program happened parallel to the Presidential Climate Commission developing a framework, a just transition framework, which has been adopted by our cabinet. And that just transition framework has 3 elements. The first element relates to the consultation. So if people who are going to be directly affected are not consulted, then the transition cannot be just. If people directly affected are not involved in the participation of co-creating, not just being beneficiaries, but co-creation of alternatives, then one can't consider the process to be just. And in our context, as a developing country, if the process doesn't also contribute to restorative justice and to the broader socio-economic development of the community as a whole, then it can't be considered to be just. At the moment, we are in discussion with the partners of the program, which includes the electricity utility and the original financiers of this program, to talk about how we put it right. Because we recognize that if we don't put the pilot right, and we don't have a pilot that is a good and a positive example, it's going to be very difficult to attract community support for additional processes of decommissioning in the future. I think the fundamental learning from this process is that it's important to front load the socio-economic development and the socio-economic change ahead of the decommissioning processes. Because although we remain convinced that there is sufficient evidence to show that alternative forms of electricity generation and alternative forms of green technological development will create jobs, they won't necessarily create them in the places that are going to be affected by the transition, unless there's a very conscious process of looking for new forms of economic development in those areas.